Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am doing a review of the short story collection, Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. I just read this and I thought it was fantastic. I think it is well known as an amazing short story collection, but I thought that I would just go through and talk about it in case anybody else hasn't read it yet or just is interested in thinking about it again. So what I found so interesting about this collection was that for me it really embodied the idea of speculative fiction. These are primarily sci-fi types of stories, but they really focus on the questions. In each story, Ted Chiang takes a what if. He takes some sort of premise and says, what if this technology existed? Or what if this had actually happened? Or what if we changed in this way? And then he follows that and keeps looking at how that would influence humanity, how that would influence our choices, our values, and what the logical conclusion of that would be. So through this journey in each short story, he brings up so many different questions, and what I really love is that these questions revolve around so many issues that are fundamental to humanity. Things about ethics and values and about what makes us human, about what we want out of our lives and what happens when we get what we want. So there's very interesting questions, some of which he sort of answers in his story and many of which he leaves open to the reader to think about and to consider. Not only are these questions really fascinating, but each of the stories is so different from the others. There's a lot of different sociological questions and religious questions and technological questions and language questions. There's so many different topics that he covers in each story, and they all have such different settings. So I'm going to talk about each story in this review, and for each story I want to talk about what is the what if, the premise that he proposed, what is a short summary of the story, and then what are the questions that I found myself thinking about as I was reading the story. The first short story in this collection is The Tower of Babylon, and the what if posed in this is, what if the historical story of the Tower of Babel had actually been true and people had built a tower that reached the heavens? So a summary of this story is basically that this takes place in ancient Babylon and the Tower of Babel was built. They had been working for generations, building up stone by stone an enormous tower that went miles into the sky and actually reached the ceiling of heaven. And in this world, heaven is like a physical ceiling. It's made out of something like granite. And so the Babylonians bring in some miners and stonemasons from other countries who come over and ascend the tower so that they can open up and mine the ceiling to heaven. And it follows in particular one of the miners as they go on this month-long journey up the tower, and as they start to mine and break through using hammers and different techniques to get through stone to enter heaven. So I think what's really interesting about this story is all of the different questions it brings up about purpose. So for example, what does it look like when for generations people have this purpose and they finally achieve it? What does it look like to build your life around a religious purpose? What does it look like when you're coming from outside and not necessarily part of that generations of purpose? How do you view that? What will people sacrifice? What will people focus on? And really, what is the culmination? If you have this enormous goal and purpose that your entire community has been working towards for generations, what does it look like when you finally achieve that? And what are the consequences if it doesn't work out exactly how you expect it to work out? The next short story is Understand. And this short story poses the what if. What if we had some sort of injections that we could give to someone that would make them much more intelligent than they were previously? And a brief summary of this is that there is a man who is kind of a little bit below average intelligence, and he ends up getting into a coma, and they use these injections to help him get out of the coma, and it also increases his intelligence significantly. So it follows him as his intelligence increases and as he becomes sort of this super intelligent human being who is able to think at such an elevated level far beyond what normal humans can think. It reminds me a little bit both of Flowers for Algernon, where a similar premise is used, and also a little bit of Sherlock Holmes, where Sherlock Holmes is one of these super intelligent humans who can see connections and think, many steps ahead of everybody else. So this raises a lot of interesting questions. It raises a lot of questions of, what does it mean for somebody to gain a lot of intelligence? How is somebody different when they have that level of intelligence? How does it change their perception of the world, their values, their goals? And does a super intelligent human have values and ethics that mirror that of normal humans, or do they end up valuing and caring about totally different things? If they end up valuing different things, then how does that mesh with the rest of humanity? And if we create people who are vastly superior in intelligence to the rest of us, then what recourse do we have if we don't agree with their actions? So a lot of interesting questions about just what are the implications of someone becoming that intelligent and their choices that they make and are able to make. The next short story is Division by Zero, and this poses the what if of what if the foundational fundamental principles of the universe that we believe in were proved false. So the summary of this story is that there's a mathematician who discovers a proof that any number can be equal to any other number. And this proof really throws her for a loop because it basically puts into question everything in math. She has proven that arithmetic doesn't hold, and everything else in math is based on some of these foundational arithmetic principles. And so she starts to question everything in her life because this is the primary thing that she believes in. And so what does she believe in if this is no longer true? This brings up so many interesting questions just about what do you do when what you base your life on is shown to be false, that everything is, in a sense, a lie? How do you cope with knowing that that is no longer true? How do you reformulate your worldview and your place in it? And when you're dealing with this sort of enormous questioning of your life and the purpose and meaning of the universe around you, how does that affect your relationships? A big part of this story is told from her husband's perspective, and there's a lot of stress on their relationship because she's going through this traumatic event and it really changes who she is and how she sees the world. And he's there trying to figure out, how do I have a relationship with somebody who is so fundamentally different from what she was before? So this is a lot of introspection into who we are, how we build up our perception of who we are, how we build up our relationships with other people based on that, and how all of that could be vastly changed if what we believed about the universe were different. The next short story in the collection is Story of Your Life. And this is using the premise of what if you could know the future of your life. It is a very interesting story. This is the story that the movie Arrival with Amy Adams was based on. So the summary of the story is that there is a linguist, and she works with a bunch of different researchers and the government to communicate with some aliens who have landed on Earth. However, these aliens have a very different way of communicating, a very different way of conceptualizing physics in the space-time continuum, because for them, time is yet another dimension that they can traverse. And so they have a very circular notion of time where they can see in the future as well as in the present, and it's all kind of mixed in together. And as she learns how to communicate with them, she also develops some of this ability to see into her own future. So The movie does a great job of showing a lot of these questions as well, if you've seen that, but it really brings up so many interesting ideas and questions. It brings up the question of how are language and thought related. There's a lot of things in linguistics about this. The theory of linguistic relativity, also known as the SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis, talks about what is the effect of our worldview on our language and the effect of our language on our worldview. So this definitely explores that idea. It also takes a look at what is the difference between feeling that you have control over your actions versus knowing what the future will be? And do you want to try to change that? And is there meaning in experiencing the present if you already know what the future will be? So a lot of questions that are just very fascinating about what does it mean to know the future, and how does that impact you in the present? The next short story is 72 Letters, and this story looks at the premise of what if we could create human life in a lab? And a summary of this story is that it is set in a Victorian England steampunk style of universe, where in this universe, scientists are able to use combinations of 72 Hebrew alphabet letters, and these are able to animate automata or golems, and they use these automata to do various kind of dumb machine tasks. But there's a scientist who discovers a new combination of these letters that enables the automata to be much more human-like, much more multi-purpose. And this creates a lot of friction with other people who are afraid of their jobs being replaced by machines. And as he researches more and more, he also discovers that some of these similar ideas could be used not only to animate automata, but also to sort of genetically modify humans and create lab babies, basically to create embryos that are built off of this rather than off of natural human production. So this brings up a lot of interesting questions of, what is okay for humans to create and what is really something a little bit too much for them to create? What is the obligation of the person who comes up with these new scientific discoveries? Should they be helping humanity? Should they be controlling the way that humanity progresses further? Is it better to help people but maybe not help other people? So lots of interesting ethical questions. Also questions of just what is the purpose of science and how should it be used and who gets to decide how it should be used. So very many ethical questions regarding humanity and the creation of human-like beings. The next short story is The Evolution of Human Science, and this uses the premise, what if we could genetically modify humans to become superhuman? A summary of this is that it takes place in the future where genetic modification has happened and it has created these superhumans. But the thing is that this creation of superhumans through genetic modification can only happen to fetuses. And so basically a human parent will decide that they want to have a superhuman child. That change will occur, but then that child will grow up to be superhuman, and these superhumans are so vastly different from regular humanity that they're basically a separate species and they no longer will interact with humans. They have their own language, their own interests, and they are vastly superior to humans in the way that they are able to do science, such that humanity itself stops doing science because it's just not relevant. They just try to translate the works of the superhumans into human language so that we can understand. So there's a lot of interesting questions about if we can modify humans to be better than we are, how far should we go? How much modification should we make? And if we do create these superhumans, how will they be different from us? Will we be able to coexist with them? Will they have the same values as us? Will they want the same outcomes? And will they work towards the same things? Or will it be really a totally different species with different values? The next short story is Hell is the Absence of God. And this uses the premise, what if God, heaven, angels, all of that were real? And this takes a very Old Testament style of view, I think, of God and heaven and hell and angels, where basically in this world, it's a modern day world, except that all of that stuff is real. And heaven just means that God is there, and hell is basically just the same as normal everyday life, except that just God isn't there. You are separated from God. You are not allowed to be close to him. And in this world, people live their daily lives, but sometimes people are cursed or blessed by God, and angels appear regularly on earth to perform miracles and also to curse people. And it's a very dangerous experience when the angels come and leave, because often bystanders will be killed and hurt. It's also not that everybody gets to go to heaven. It's not just if you're a nice person you go to heaven. It's very much if you are a true believer, you go. So only if deep in your heart you truly believe and love God, you go to heaven. Otherwise, you go to hell. But hell's just basically the absence of God. So in this world, there's a man, Neil, and his wife is a true believer. She ends up being killed when she's a bystander to an angel's visitation. And because she's a true believer, she goes to heaven. And now Neil is stuck in the position of wanting to be with his wife in heaven, but he is not a true believer. Except that it's very hard to start believing. How do you start believing in God when you've seen your wife, who's a wonderful person, just be killed as a bystander? So it follows his progression as he's trying to figure out how to believe in God so that he can go to heaven and join his wife. This brings up so many interesting questions. It brings up questions of, if God and angels and everything existed, what would they be like? And what would their values be? What would their goals be? How would they view humanity and care about humanity? And what would they want? It also brings up a lot of questions of faith. What does it mean to truly believe? What does it mean to want to believe, even if things around you don't really work out for you? And in this, it's more of a belief in terms of believing that God is wonderful and you love him, rather than believing that he exists, because everybody knows he exists. That's not the question. The question is, do you love God, I guess, and want to be with him? And so it also brings into question, can you truly love God if you also love another human being so strongly? So there's a lot of really interesting questions, and questions of, if you are a true believer, but you're separated from God, what does that mean? And what is suffering and what is joy? There's a lot of questions that revolve around those issues. And the last short story is Liking What You See, a documentary. This uses the premise of, what if we were able to turn off that part of our brains that allows us to perceive physical, facial beauty and attractiveness? So this takes place in a world where something called kaliagnosia, a new technology, has been discovered, and it turns off the part of your brain that allows you to perceive facial beauty. So you can still perceive everything in terms of shapes and colors and whatever, but you don't have that physical reaction to beauty and attractiveness. And this story takes place maybe a generation after it has been discovered, and there are some children who have grown up using it, there are some who don't, and it is something that is reversible, it's changeable, so you can get it and then remove it. The documentary follows students at a university who are trying to vote on a measure of whether or not this should be mandatory at their university. And so it goes through interviewing different students about their thoughts on it and why they would want or not want that to be mandatory. So this story brings up a lot of interesting questions about ethics and values. So what is the purpose of perceiving beauty? And what are the detrimental aspects of, treating people differently based on that beauty? How do people care about beauty, and is that something you should care about? Do people abuse their beauty? Do people abuse the basic idea that we have beauty? There's a lot of questions of also just sort of what are the purposes of, in general, our abilities to perceive different things. If we could turn off our ability to perceive beauty, should we turn off our ability to perceive other things? And if so, where does that stop? So I think that this collection of short stories is so fascinating for all of the different questions it raises and the way that it follows these premises of what if we invented this or we did this, how would that affect us as humans, how would we change? I think what's really fascinating about this collection is also it's very sci-fi, but none of it even takes place in space. It's all about us and our world and our values and how we could change based on the technology and the reality around us. I think that this collection is so amazing for how thought-provoking it is, and I hope that my discussing the various questions that I thought these stories brought up made you think a little bit as well. If you have read this collection or you have any thoughts about any of these stories, I would love to hear what you have to say, so please leave a comment below.